Hi everyone, so in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to paint a horse eye in acrylics. So let's jump straight into step 1, and for me I want to make sure that I've got the shape of the eye accurate right from the beginning. This is something that we often think, oh, I can change the shape of that later, I want to focus on the colour. But it really doesn't work like that. I do find that if we've noticed something that needs changing, it's best to do that as early as I can. So by making sure that I'm mapping in the outside shape of the eye first, I can then worry and focus about the colours and building up the iris, all of those details within the eye later on. If I know that I've got my outside shape accurate, then it's just a matter of then breaking down that process layer by layer. But I know right from the beginning that I've got my proportions and my perspective right. So all I'm doing here is I'm starting off just with my shadows, putting in my darks first. This is just normal black on its own. The brand of paint that I like to use are Liquitex Basics. Now I'll go through that as we get through the layering process, but mainly because they have beautiful transparent colours and I like working with glazes. I don't worry about the colour mixing early on at all, and you will see that throughout this video. Now horse eyes are very different to most other animals, the shape but also the pupil shape, and you can see here just what I mean by that. This is much more of a rectangular shape, but they're curved at either end. It doesn't have a round pupil, they don't have that diamond shaped pupil like some cats have, so that is something to pay very close attention to. Once I've got the shape and the darks mapped in, this is where I start to reinforce some of my brighter eyelid areas. Now the one thing that's important here is you will see I am using a mid-tone grey. I haven't jumped into using my brightest mixture first, and this is really important. I talk about this in all of my tutorials, both here on YouTube and my slower in-depth tutorials on Patreon. If I jump to my lightest values too early on, I then have nowhere else to go. So I've put in all of those highlights early on. I'm not going to be able to build up the depth with my future layers. So I do want to be making sure that I am working from dark to light. So something that I would just like to mention is, as you can see here, I am pointing at my surface, I'm explaining what I'm doing, and that's because this horse eye study is available on Patreon now as a real-time tutorial. So I decided to do the voiceover while I'm painting. That's how I do all of my tutorials now, so it's very step by step. I'm explaining everything in the moment at the time. So if you would like to see all of this real-time tutorial, it's about 5 hours long, then head over to my Patreon channel where you get the reference photo, liner and full material list. So it's a perfect one to follow along to. I show lots of other techniques as well. As you can see here on the bottom eyelid, everything's starting to look a bit soft. And that's because I'm using some blending and softening techniques either through wet on wet blending or using my 2-brush system. I will be using a brush to apply the paint and I will be using another brush to blend the paint. This is one of my favourite blending and softening techniques and it works really well with acrylics. I do know that acrylics, one of the most common problems, because it's one of the common questions that I'm asked, is how do I overcome the fast drying time? Now for me, in most cases, I actually speed up the drying time using a hairdryer. But if you need to, you can keep that paint wet for as long as you need. There are a couple of ways to do that, and I do show one of those in this tutorial. The other option is to use a fine mist spray bottle, and I've got lots of tutorials on YouTube and Patreon showing you how you can use that to make acrylics act just like oils. So now that I'm starting to build up more of the area around the eye, these darker eyelid areas, you can really see how these blending techniques are coming into their own and helping to build up that smooth skin texture that horses have immediately around the eye. This is all a layering process, and as you can see, what I've mentioned earlier, I am working from dark to light, and I always reinforce my contrast. Now contrast is something I speak about in all tutorials because it makes a real difference. If your shadows aren't dark enough and your highlights aren't bright enough, the painting will just be generally far flatter. It doesn't matter if the colour is spot on, because if the contrast isn't right, it will just look very two-dimensional. So here, that's why I'm going back in, adding some highlights, darkening up my shadows, and just tweaking those minor little alterations. Now, this area is not complete. There's a lot still that I need left to do, but I can happily leave it at this stage and now start working on the eye. Now, my approach to any subject, regardless of what it is that I'm working on, is I always want to break it up into small, manageable chunks. It stops us from becoming too overwhelmed, and we are a lot more effective with how we work. So what I've got here is I've switched over to a filbert shaped brush just so I can get a bit more of a quicker coverage, and I'm mapping in the highlight at the top of the eye. This is going to allow me to break up this larger circular area, and I can then just focus on my shapes. The best thing and the best advice that I could give when you're working on something that you find challenging, focus on abstract shapes. You can turn that painting around upside down, do the same to your reference photo, and then just paint what you see, because your brain is forced to see it for the shapes rather than, in this case, a horse's eye. By the time you get that area done and you turn everything back up the right way, you'll be surprised at how much more accurate that looks than when you were working with it up the right way. It's just because our brain is processing that image in a different context. So it's at this point where I leave that to dry, and then I'm going to start mapping in my iris colour. Now, something that I've done for the last couple of tutorials is I am using a colour wheel there, and you saw it in view, where I'm showing my Patreon members how I'm selecting or how I'm mixing my specific colours depending on what I can see in the reference photo. Now, the reason why I decided to buy a colour wheel so that I could physically show that during the tutorials while I'm explaining the entire process is because one of the most common questions that I'm asked is, how do I know which colour to mix? Because it can be very tricky. We've got quite a few tubes of paint to select from. How do I know which colour I should be using? Now, this colour wheel, as soon as you notice or you research colour wheel, it starts to get very confusing, but it doesn't have to be. I break this up into one simple method. I'm not focusing on the technical side of the colour wheel at all. The way that I select my colours is all based on whether or not it is a warm colour or if it is a cool colour. Now, this is why a simple colour wheel and having that in front of you can take out all of the stress of knowing which colour you should select. So if that aspect of mixing your paints is something that you find quite challenging, then this tutorial and my other tutorials on Patreon may be of interest. And as I've said, I will link my Patreon channel in the description below if those tutorials are potentially of use. And if you've got any art related questions as well, or anything about Patreon that you would potentially want to know before you join, then feel free to pop them in the comments below. Now, as I've been building up my layers here, you can see that I'm reinforcing the shape of the pupil, making sure that that is as dark as what's required. And I've also hinted at the subtle reflection on the right hand side of the eye. Here, I want to be making sure that I don't just put one solid colour down for my base layer. You can see that throughout this, not just for the eyelid area, but the iris, I've always made sure that I'm hinting at my lights and my darks at the base layer stage. I have a lot of layers to build up, and the next step is starting to add in some of those very subtle reflections within the iris and on top of that surface of the eye. But before I get to that stage, I do have to make sure that I've got my darkest values in first, and I've got the soft marble glassy effect in place. It's not going to be as refined as it will look when the painting is finished, but this is a really good soft blended base layer. I'm hinting at the light source in the eye where you've got those lights and darks. This is so important. Even at this stage now, this eye is starting to build up more of a three-dimensional shape because I've got my contrast right, the highlights bright, and the shadows around the eye and inside the eye are dark. And now I'm going to start building up those lighter layers. Now, the most important thing, and you'll see this on all of my YouTube tutorials, is I build up my layers gradually. I said this in the eyelid as well, that section. You don't want to be jumping to your brightest highlights early on. This is the one main way that we're going to significantly limit the amount of depth and realism that we can capture within the painting. So it doesn't just have to be when we're painting fur with all of those layers of depth with all the tiny hairs. Eyes are no exception. We have to make sure that we're building up that beautiful marble effect and the pattern of the iris. And that's all that I'm going to be doing here is a rinse and repeat process. Every time I get an area about halfway complete, I then start to look at the other area that I've already painted in, which is where I'm working at the moment, just again reinforcing those contrasts. I always want to make sure that my shadows are dark and my highlights are bright. I say it so often, but this is the thing that's going to help to build up the shape of the eye. After that, as you can see, I'm gradually adjusting the colour through the use of simple glazes. Once those glazes are dry, I'm then adding the next lighter layer. I will wait for that to dry and then I'll add another glaze. This is my preference for the layering process when adjusting the colour, and I do this on fur as well. If colour mixing is something that you do find fairly stressful, we don't have to focus on that at all throughout those beginning stages. We could easily do a painting in monochrome, black and white, and then add our colour with glazes later on. It's more than achievable to focus on your values first, as I am here. This eye is nowhere near as vibrant as what it's going to look when it's finished, but most importantly, it's looking three-dimensional because my contrast is good. So before I move on to the structures around the eye and painting in all of those hair and fur details, if this tutorial has been useful so far, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload 2 to 3 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then hit the subscribe and the bell button. So onto this very first layer. Now you can see that first base layer, I'm just mapping in again my lights and my darks, just as I did with the eye itself. My second layer is all about refining that process. But my most important aim is I want to get my edges, my transitions from one colour to the next, from shadows to highlights, soft. I don't want there to be any harsh start and stop points. This is one of the elements that I think is definitely more challenging with acrylics because of that fast drying time that I mentioned earlier on in the video. So if you would like to see how I have created this soft effect, because of this is all recorded in real time on Patreon, that tutorial may be of interest. But once you work on the detailed layers and you've built up this base foundation, it's really important to let it dry. Give it a good 5 to 10 minutes, make sure it's fully dry before we start mapping in these details. Now for these details, what I decided to do is go in and use a rake brush. They're often also called grass comb brushes, depending on who makes them and the brand. But as you can see here, for one brush stroke that I create, because of the way that the brush is made, it actually paints 4 or 5 individual brush strokes. So this actually paints fur texture very quickly. Now the one massive tip, this is huge, that I would give anybody when using a rake brush is you don't want to just rely on this one brush for fur texture. Because as you can start to see here, it does a really good job, it builds up the texture, but the hairs and the fur, it starts to look a bit fake. And that's because this brush, although it is good for building texture, you do have a tendency to get a little bit more of a uniform look. Now hair and fur is very random, as we know, so this isn't a brush that I would recommend from start to finish. What I'm going to do is once I've finished with the rake brush, I then go over to my smaller liner brushes and I add in the individual hairs on top. This is something I would always recommend to do. I personally feel like I get the most out of that amount of detail and more of a photorealistic painting. So because I wanted to keep this focus tutorial on Patreon just mainly on the eye itself and those eyelid and the structures around it, I didn't want to focus too much on all of the hair details, but I did show the layering process that I would be using if this was a commission and a pet portrait. Because how we build up the details around the eye ultimately makes that eye look like it's part of that face, which is obviously what we want. We don't want there to be any harsh edges, which is why I'm going round with my softer mid-tone greys here and blending that colour into the brown. Because any harsh edges that I create that aren't meant to be there will make it look like that eye's far more two-dimensional. You don't want to square off those edges. So this is why I'm taking the time here to do that same wet and wet blending technique. I'm applying some details, I'm then softening them out to make sure that all of this is following that lovely rounded structure that horse eyes have. As I've said, the anatomy of a horse eye is very different. They're meant to look like they are a bit further out of the skull compared to other animals. They've got those more pronounced eye sockets. All of this is going to create highlights and shadows. Now, one thing that I talk about in all of the tutorials, and it is also included on my top tips for painting realistic fur, I'll link that tutorial, which is here on YouTube, in the description below if it's of interest. Now, the way that the highlights and shadows are positioned on an animal's face or body are never random. They will always follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. So take the eye socket at the top, everything here is catching more of a highlight because it's more pronounced. That highlight has to be in the right place in order to follow the structure of that animal's face. So that means then if we don't get these highlights and shadows accurate, we will then change what that animal looks like. Now, of course, if this is a pet portrait, that's going to cause a real problem because it won't resemble that person's pet as much as it should. So here, where I start adding my details with my liner brush, notice how I'm always reinforcing where those highlights and shadows are. It's always about following that reference photo as closely as we can. Another element that I talk about on my top tips for painting realistic fur is the fur length, the fur thickness, and fur direction. All of these things we sort of make the decision at the time when we're creating those brush strokes. The amount of pressure you apply to that brush will vary how thick that line is going to be. So that's a massive thing that's going to decide that fur texture and how you're creating that. The fur length is obviously going to be varied depending on how long that brush is in contact with that surface. The shorter hairs that I'm painting here, I'm easing into the pressure. I put more pressure for the middle of the stroke and then I lift off and ease off of that pressure. That's going to create beautiful tapered points at the beginning and the end and give me more of a natural, realistic fur texture. And then, as always, I usually refine my colour with a simple glaze at the end. This is going to make that look more like the reference photo. Some of that colour is going to really look like it is glowing. So here is a photo of that finished study, and I do hope this tutorial has been of interest. If it was, as I said, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. I would be so grateful. And if my in-depth, slower tutorials on Patreon are of interest, that link to that Patreon channel is in the description below. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.